I'm Matti Heino. I'm doing my PhD in the University of Helsinki, and my topic is the topic of this symposium, as it happens by coincidence, and I'll just actually go right ahead and talk about some complexity features of sort of that I started running into after I was tasked to find the mechanisms of impact in a traditional data set that consisted of 2 or 3 measurement points and about 1,000 individuals undergoing an intervention. So a lot of variables, a lot of people, but only few measurement occasions. And we'll talk about how to think about these different data or design structures next. And by the way, Mintu or Sarmita, could you send Jari the Slack link? So. Mm-hmm. I'm not seeing anything happening. Okay, this should be fine. So let's go. What we usually see when we read an article, or especially if we only read the abstract or the results section, is some sort of a caricature of the reality, some sort of a gross simplification that has undergone that has passed through this sort of a veil in order to be communicated in a sensible manner. And it tries to condense all the richness of the reality into something understandable and communicable. And this is, of course, necessary in order to be able to transmit ideas in some form, but sometimes we are making some simplifications that actually distort the whole reality. So there was in the 80s, there was this person, Benoit Mandelbrot, who made a contribution in many different fields. Well, since the 80s, 90s, past that also, but he was really annoyed by the way how people in economics tend to condense rich dynamics into very simplified models, and he came up with this new type of mathematics to work with those phenomena. And what he says was that clouds are not spheres, mountains are not cones, coastlines are not circles, and bark is not smooth, nor does lightning travel in a straight line. So when we are making this, condensing this reality into a transmittable form, we need to understand what are the features that are important so we don't lose those in the transformation process. And I'm going to offer 3 perspectives into this. They are basically from this preprint you find here. And to start with is the interconnectedness of timescales and interconnectedness of observations in general. So what we usually do is in normal regression models, we always assume that the observations are independent of each other. We also assume that they are homogeneous, I mean, very similar to each other, or there are clusters that we know how to deal with. And the traditional way is to try and use different statistical tricks in order to make the observations as close to the independence assumption as possible. And so first, in order to make some sense, I need to explain what a time series is, because that's I learned that it's not clear for everyone. Oh, do I have a pointer? Yeah. Okay, so here is 3 variables that a person has logged into their, they have answered 3 questions on their mobile phone repeatedly during a, like twice a day, during a, over the course of 40 days. And this is the time series is formed by these observations put in a temporal sequence. I'll later mention what the change profile is. But so if you only take one of these variables, we'll not focus on the multivariate case, but the conventional way of modeling time series is to use this autoregressive models, where you assume that only the previous time point has an effect on the subsequent time point. And I encourage you to read these 2 papers. They are excellent. We also have Merlin as part of the conference. He's you can find him on Slack and tag him and ask many questions, hopefully. He's a PhD student of Fred Hasselman. This is an excellent paper if you are thinking about measurement and how to deal with all the peculiarities that make human self-reports very different from physical time series. I can put those things up when I finish the chat. So basically, what Merlin goes through here in this paper is that many of the features that we have learned from the study of living systems in physics and biology over the last maybe only 2 decades. We can find many of those features in any human data that is sufficiently long so that we can actually study whether it has those features and the dynamical features. And one of these things is the fact that, okay, so we have, instead of having only the previous time point matter, if we think about what matters for this time point, this measurement here, what matters is not only the quite a few measurements that came before it, but also things from the distant past can have an effect on that time point. And for the previous time point, the same thing. And the previous time point, the same thing. So things that happened long ago may have an impact on how things seem right now. And this is, of course, self-explanatory or like obvious when you think about the human context and living the human life. But when we put that in a statistical model, we usually think that, okay, this is not something that we care about. And also to make it more simple is that we think that all of these have a similar impact. So we take an average effect and think that simplify the model so that every time point that came before has a similar impact to the next one. But these can also vary and vary in time, so that things that came 3 days before somewhere here might be important, and around here things that came the previous day might be more important, and so forth. And this leads to something called multiplicative dynamics. So you have an additive dynamic going on when you can do basically a regression equation where you have a lot of things and a plus sign in between of those things. And that's quite well behaved, and it simplifies the analysis a lot if you're willing to make that assumption. But the thing is that if we have these multiplicative dynamics where the previous time points have an effect from long distant past, and they can actually accumulate and pile up and create these domino effects. That means that we are no longer bounded in the world of the normal distribution, and we can have events that actually where one event has a larger impact than everything else combined. And mathematically speaking, it might be that in a distribution like this, you are not allowed to work with mean or variance at all because they are not well specified. One example, like real-world example, is pandemics. So you can have a lot of, actually, a lot of pandemics are very, very small, don't kill many people, but then some are absolutely humongous. And this creates a problem where you have this networked, where individuals are networked, and when one individual collapses, it can take many of the neighbors with them. In such situations, it can become very hard to predict what's going on in the what will happen in the system when we do an intervention, and we need to be very careful when we do any interventions. Secondly, we'll talk about, I'll mention the ergodicity problem that's been quite a lot in the forefront. There was a 2018 paper by Aaron Fisher, where he said that the lack of group to individual generalizability is a threat to human subjects research. I'll explain what this means. This is called the Cattell's data box. So we have variables as columns, and we have individuals as rows, and the depth is measurement occasions or time points. So this is what we normally do. We have one time point, or 2 or 3, and we have tons of individuals. And an alternative thing that has been arising in health psychology or in behavioral medicine lately is the N-of-1 study. So you have a lot of variables, a lot of occasions, and you have only one individual. And these are sort of the dimensions that you can think about, because they are, in terms of difficulty of research, there is some sweet spot, but it can be very hard to get 1,000 observations from 1,000 people. So these are, in a sense, trade-offs. But the wonderful thing about what we call ergodic systems is that you can take this take the one occasion of a lot of individuals and a lot of variables and draw conclusions about individuals in time. And this is, of course, it would be very, very pleasant if this would work, but it turns out that it doesn't, at least very well in human systems. So the idea is that you have this, you have days here, and you have people on rows, and you have if you would take a correlation or mean or whatever from everyone at their day 1 in an ergodic system, this red box would correspond to how the correlation works within the individual. But these two don't need to have anything to do with each other, apart from special conditions, which are that the time average and the ensemble average. So this is the time average over people, over one person in time, and this is the ensemble average, so an ensemble of individuals. And so if time average and ensemble average are equal, then the system is ergodic. So, for example, in a society, if you would have 100 possible professions, every person would spend 1/100th of their time in each. And measuring one single person 100 times would be you would get the same result as measuring 100 people one time. And when a process is or a system is ergodic, then it's okay to generalize from group levels to individuals. But if it's not, then we're doing the ecological fallacy. And a problem is that most or all phenomena in psychology or behavior change are not ergodic, and we can't do this thing where we take a lot of people and conclude that, okay, so these two things are connected or correlated on the individual level. And the thing is that we sort of know this. We know it from real life, but we know it from a theoretical point of view also. For example, the self-determination theory says that the humans grow and develop, and they are agents with intrinsic activity, and these organismic integration tendencies that preclude a uniformly reductionist analysis. So if these people change in their own idiosyncratic developmental trajectories, then we're dealing with a non-ergodic system. And this formulation of the idea actually brings it much, quite close to what these other sciences have been talking about in living systems, for example, self-organized criticality. And I thoroughly recommend this book. It's quite short and well written on the topic of self-organized criticality. I tried to read articles about self-organized criticality and I didn't understand it, but reading this book, it gave me the first actual clue on how it works. And the third thing I promised to talk about is linearity. So we make the simplification that we have these rich nonlinear dynamics. I'll tell you soon what it means. And we basically say that, okay, so that's not meaningful, and what's important is whether something goes up or down, so in a linear sort of way. So anyone who has ever seen a dose dependence curve, you know that like anything in behavior change or anywhere where you have an like a dose and a response, you have some sort of a nonlinear curve. And that just means that during most parts of this graph, like 1 unit of dose doesn't lead to 1 unit of response. And so if we think about physical activity, here's a zone where you get a lot better by any increase, and then the curve slopes downward. So we call this the concave part and this the convex part. And if you keep on increasing it, your activity levels, eventually you will die. So this is something that you might want to, or something that's obvious, we take it into account in normal life. Here's a very nice paper explaining the nonlinear responses in the medical domain. So where this leads to, if we have this, if we don't have a direct relationship between the magnitude of an event and the effect of that event, it leads to a situation where things can be quite unpredictable. So if you think of the camel and you start loading straws on the camel's back, and you load them one by one and one by one, and then at some point the back breaks. Was there something special about the last straw? Was the last critical straw, did it possess some special camelback breaking features or something like this? No, it was just something that accumulated over time. And this is something we see in systems dynamics, and I will show you. Actually, yeah. So here's some of my own data. I've been tracking my work motivation. I've been doing daily assessment, and then I've been doing a weekly work motivation survey. And you can see that there is not really a linear increase, but how things, this is over 100 weeks or something like this. So you have something goes up and down and up and down, and then you have a high period here, and then you drop, and then here you see a drop. So how do we study these systems? Well, first of all, something that can be very useful is to think about what Gwen Marchand spoke about yesterday, about interaction dominant and component dominant systems. And this is a quite an important distinction. So there are some resources in our Slack channel in the learning materials where you can find more information about what this distinction is. But like in an interaction dominant system, you have these component parts, and what's dominating the system is the interactions between those parts instead of the nature of those parts themselves. So I'll just read this a lot. So in an interaction dominant system, inherent variability, i.e. fluctuations or noise of any individual component, propagates through the system as a whole. So if one thing changes, it starts changing other things in that system. And so it affects these other components, and because it's connected, these other components and changes that went on in these will again feed back to the thing that started the whole cycle. So you can start seeing this domino effects, or something that reverberates. It changes first this thing, and then that changes a lot of things here, and then it comes back somehow, maybe in a modified fashion, to the thing that first started it. So we have a reverberating network of stuff. And the happy thing about this is that because everything is connected to everything else, you don't necessarily need to pinpoint something very specific to study in the human psychology. Some people may disagree, but this is something I'm hoping will pan out in the next few years. But you can just study something that's with any part of that one system and try by the dynamics and the wiggling of that thing, try to infer the dynamics of the system as a whole. So one conceptual model of how this has been studied has been in Merlin Althoff's piece, where you have this stable period of, let's say, psychopathology, so or well-being or something. So it doesn't change a lot from one day to the next, but then something happens, something starts happening. So the system starts instabilizing or destabilizing. It starts undergoing a lot of unpredictable fluctuations. And the return time from, if you are, for example, feeling really good, the next day you feel really bad, and then the return time to feeling very good again, it can start to lengthen, or the other way around. So we say the autocorrelation tends to increase, and the return times increase, and then the theory of synergetics predicts that this period here is predictive of, so the system undergoes some sort of a phase transition from one state to another state. And this is from last year, Merlin's piece where he introduces this idea in a sample of individuals who every day monitor their psychopathological symptoms. And what they find is that actually, yes, this is something that happens. But I will give you a more maybe behavioral medicine example. So this is a paper we've been working with Guillaume Chavance. Guillaume is also somewhere around and also on Slack, so you can ask him questions about this. But basically, we have step data from an intervention. And so these are people who are taking part in a weight loss intervention. So presumably they're trying to increase their daily step counts. So these are all the steps they're taking every day. And you can see we first run an algorithm that tries to find these sudden shifts that last at least 1 week. So here we have a shift up in the activity pattern, and here we have a shift down and some fluctuations, and then again a sudden drop and a sudden drop and a sudden increase. And what we tried to find out was whether these drops and increases are predicted by this sort of a instability period. And this is something that actually panned out, but only for the losses, not the gains. And so the conceptual, one possible explanation, and Daniela Proverbio will talk about these sudden gains and losses today. He is an expert on the topic, and Ken Resnicoe is going to talk about the idea also. But one thing that we are thinking could be happening in this particular context is that you have we call this an attractor landscape. So we have like a system that is here and some random daily events, whether you slept well or didn't, and whether you were feeling energetic and so forth. And they can turn this, push this ball here or here. So this is a low activity attractor, and this is a high activity attractor. So you can be in either place. So if you get a push, you can go here and then fall back. You can go here and then fall back. And if you get a really big push, then you can actually cross this tipping point and go down to the high activity attractor, where you move more during the day. And alternatively, so this attractor landscape, it's not stable, so it can change over time. So it can so this hump here can actually become more less high. So these become more shallow, these attractors, and now like random daily events, they can push you from here to here and so forth, and you start seeing this instability. And then when the attractor landscape again shifts, you can find yourself trapped in either one of these places. But as we saw, the instability was predictive of sudden losses. So it could actually be that this low activity place here is always more deeper than the high activity one. And Gwen Marchand showed you this yesterday. So you have these micro level constituents that lead to the macro level emergent state of the system. So you can think of this in a behavior change context. This could be, I'll actually go to this one. So this could be different variables or determinants of behavior, and this could be like a state that's the high activity state or the low activity state. But something that I wanted to point out about this picture is that, well, you have these, we call them nodes, and we call the connections edges. But each of these nodes in the network, so you can think of this as people. The nodes can be people, or the nodes can be things inside a person. So, well, we can think of these as, if we think of these as people and they create some macro level behavior that is the state of the community, for example. This person is also a result of, and this person's behavior is the result of some network of their determinants of the behavior. And each of these determinants of behavior are again networks of other things. And you can go as deep as you want with this hierarchy, and maybe in the end you'll end up in the quantum level, but that might not be too useful if you want to study behavior change. But there's a poem that goes, "Great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum." This was a 19th century mathematician who was talking about some sort of the fractal structure of how things consist of other things. So I will tell you why this is relevant. So we have these three variables. I'm actually not going to go through the change profile. You can find it in this paper. It's a transformation you do to a time series of self-reports in order to make it more consistent with the idea how the measurement actually happens. So Fred Hasselman, the first author of this paper, was he had this experience where he had been giving a food delivery service. He had been giving them 1 or 2 stars previously because the food had hair in it, or it was cold, or it was a completely different thing from what they ordered. But then one day, their family ordered food, and they all got food poisoning. And after this event, 1 star out of 5 stars was a very, very different thing. So when we do repeated self-reports of some of our internal states, we always have in our minds some scale that might shift across time. And the change profile is a way to try and adjust for this. But I'm going to talk about recurrences. So in here, you would have a recurrence here and a recurrence here. Those are the same value, or approximately the same value will recur again. You would have maybe, you can figure out the range of values or the radius that you consider approximately equivalent. So this might be equivalent to this, and so forth. So we take all of these time points, and in this, so this is a method called multiplicative recurrence networks. So we take all of these time points and you put them in a sequence, and you connect those time points, those nodes. So this is now basically a network. So you connect those nodes with each other if the value that was here repeats itself later at some point of time. So here we have a value that repeats, that this value actually repeats again here. And the colors are just the days of the week. So now we have these 3 variables where everything that recurs are plotted in a sort of a network. And so this is called a recurrence network. And so recurrence is, it's sort of like covariance, but it doesn't make any assumptions about the importance of the mean or the median. and whether a thing is above or below the mean or the median, unlike covariance does. But so it's a non-linear way of thinking about covariance. This is in time. So now we have actually a network of 3 networks of these variables that contain all the temporal information, and we haven't done any, we haven't lost information in, for example, aggregating or averaging these things. And so next, you can see that, for example, here you have the node number 1 that is below this label. It has 1, 2, probably has a connection tree that you can't see because it's under the nodes. And so this one doesn't have doesn't seem to have any connections in the first few, but this one has at least 1, maybe 2 or 3 connections in the first one, and so forth. So when you plot them, it looks like this. So this was the competence. Yeah, this might not be the same data, but conceptually, you can see that so we have the competence variable that the first 4 data points, first 5 data points, they don't recur later at all. And then you have this time point, maybe 7 or something, that recurs 9 times later, and so forth. And you can see that this dashed line, that is the competence variable, it's quite different from the autonomy variable, so the green line, or the relatedness variable, the bluish line. And what we do in the multiplex recurrence network analysis is we take the mutual information of these distributions of recurrences. And mutual information is sort of like correlation, but it doesn't make, again, assumptions about linearity or the importance of the mean and so forth. And we have a sort of like a correlation matrix. So, but it's a mutual information matrix, and a layer, I'm calling a layer the recurrence network. So here you have like the connection between autonomy and relatedness, and you can plot it as a network. Also, I've made the connections that can be attributed to randomness. I've made them dashed, so you can shuffle the series. You can shuffle all of these variables, so you keep the same values, but you just randomize their order, and you do that many times, and you see, okay, so is the largest number or the largest strength or the largest dependence relationship here, is it larger than the observed relationship? And if what you observe is larger than, for example, 19 randomized things, then you can conclude that it's statistically significant on the 1 in 20 level, which is the 0.05 we all know and love. So what we did was we had this the time series. We made them into these recurrence networks. We had 3 networks, and we looked at the number of times things recur, and we created then the network where we have the connections of these different things. So this is how the analysis works. I would have hoped I had some results to show you, but I don't, because yes, I haven't finished working with this yet. But so just to wrap up, complex systems can be, but we can know what the system's properties are and which features are making the system vulnerable or resilient and so forth. And so we might need to change our focus a bit from trying to predict what happens next to actually looking at what the system is like and what are the possibilities that can. And I'm making human here in blue on purpose because I find it very hard to believe that any living system or a human system could actually not exhibit the features of complex systems. So this was my talk. I'm happy to check out if you have any questions.
There are questions from GJ in the Q&A box. Maybe start with the second one. Or do we want to unmute GJ so you can? Sarminte, can you find Hjaltjorn? I cannot unmute GJ. Peters.
I think I might be unmuted now.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Oh, awesome. Whoa, that was, again, really cool, Matti. Thank you very much. Awesome. So I have two questions, but one was like really all the way in the beginning. So the second one might be more interesting, also because the first one was super detailed. I was, as you may have expected, fascinated by your statement that it's not really so super important to figure out which parts of the system to target. So I thought about it for a while, and I kind of get it, of course. You can kind of wiggle somewhere, and everything's connected, figure out how the system works. And I mean, I'm clearly like a complete newbie in the complexity stuff, so this will probably have been solved already. But there are still better or worse bits to start like shaking the system, right?
Yeah, sure. And that's where we can use things we know about what's reasonable for a system to change. So you might not want to just go and hit a person with a baseball bat. But
in some settings,
choose something.
In some settings, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of context dependence.
But the wiggling would require, because I mean, so I'm sold on this very depressing conclusion that humans are not ergodic systems, obviously. So that would mean that you would have to map the systems for individual humans, and then hopefully at some point you can find regularities that hold over humans, but you'd have to start like intra-human. Mm-hmm. And wiggling the system then would require, I guess, some experiments, you know, so you might want to use a baseball bat, or you might want to use a knife, or, you know, you might want to use different kinds of manipulations that have to work to target different bits of the system to figure out how it works. So is that correct, that assumption, that you actually need a lot of experiments intra-individually, and then hopefully, and then you move on to the next person once you mapped the systems a bit?
Well, you can, of course, do it in parallel. So you have so this is something that Eric Heckler is doing. So he's, we spoke about this yesterday. So he's having this system, like this health coach system that adapts to or tunes itself to the what happens, how this what matters for that particular person. But I think one thing is, because one problem is that if we figure out what matters for this person, and then we can be, okay, hey, that's all well and good, but what happens 1 year from now? It can be completely different. Of course, it depends on what we are finding out, but the system is sort of non-stationary in the way that what mattered today might not matter tomorrow. So basically, I think eventually what we need to do is have people figure this out by themselves, because I'm being a bit skeptical about being able to actually figure out, as a researcher, figure out the systems that work with all the context dependence that happens in these people's idiosyncratic relationships. But what we can do is try and have the person adapt all the behavior change stuff to their own context. So we kind of shift the complexity of the research, the burden. We put the burden on the individual, which needs help in many situations, for example, weight loss or whatever. But then we need to, again, provide resources so that the individual can put some of the complexity on a health coach or an app or something like this. But the individual is in the center of the coordination, so to say.
Cool. So that would kind of solve it for behavior change, right? What do we do with the science of psychology?
I don't think we have time for this discussion now.
Oh yeah, good point. Thank you very much.
We are a bit late with schedule, but thank you anyway.
We can continue on Slack. Thank you.
Maybe we'll mute GJ now.
Well, I'll just say that we can have for example, a science of pandemics, although every pandemic is caused by a different pathogen working on different routes and so forth. It's just one thing we can figure out about pandemics is, for example, their properties. So if there is a pandemic that kills over 10,000 people, what is the average number of people it will kill? And it can be very different. For example, if we consider it the death rates normally distributed or power law distributed. So there is a power law exponent to this severity of pandemics, for example, which is very low, and the power law exponent that actually describes the amount of wiggle room in the system, and the exponent itself can be normally distributed. So we can build some science looking at maybe a bit different things. So things that define the wiggling room, for example, for phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.